So I did some video earlier on a 99 Honda Acty Timing belt and water pump job. The audio came out really bad, so I did a really horrible voiceover. This is the simplified procedure. There'll be some more brackets and little bolts to do, but this is the majority of the job. It should take about 5 to 6 hours to do. If you do them frequently, less time, of course. But here we go. So today we're doing a timing belt on a 99 Honda Acty. First steps: remove the washer reservoir, disconnect the battery. This is similar to the early 90s Actys. Just a few more sensors, a few more parts. I've already got the dust shield for the alternator belt off, just 10mm head bolts, and the 10mm headed bolts to twist the dipstick tube out of the way. You don't want to remove it, it'll leak the oil out. So you just remove those bolts. Make sure to jack it up by the frame so you get the axle droop. It gives you more access to the engine. With that out of the way, you have 4 more inches of space in there to work with. Here you just loosen this 12mm bolt for the adjustment on the alternator, and that 14mm alternator bolt, and it will fall right down and the belt will pop right out. There's a 3-cylinder fuel-injected version of the earlier 90s Actys. It's very similar, like I said, with the sensors. There is a Hall sensor over here. It has a plastic cover, 2 10mm bolts, and then the Hall sensor is just the one 10mm bolt, and it pops right out, right there. We'll have access to get an impact on the crank pulley now, and remove this mount. We'll support it with a piece of wood and a jack under the oil pan, and it'll allow us to move it up and down to wiggle certain things out. I got the mount pulled here. It's 3 14mm bolts. You have to drop the engine down a little bit to get that stud out of the bracket itself. You got to drop the engine about 1 to 2 inches, and it'll allow you to twist and pop it out of where it's supposed to, where it belongs. Just 1 14mm nut and 2 14mm bolts. To get the bracket off, it'll have 3 14mm bolts and 1 10mm bolt for a ground strap. The top one you could get with a wrench. Bottom one's a little bit harder with a ratchet. Takes some moving of the engine to get all the bolts out. The top bolt I left in the bracket while removing the bracket out. There's a sleeve on the bottom that usually hangs out in the timing cover. Make sure to pull that out and put it with your bracket, and don't forget it. It's just these 3 14mm bolts and the 12mm bolt with alternator. I've removed the covers. Those are pretty simple, just 10mm bolts around the circumference, and one in the middle there, and a couple of clips on the side and bottom, and then pull the bottom cover off. And I pushed the top cover out of the top. It's got a clip that kind of clips in on this side. It's not part of the zip tie, it's part of the cover itself. Once you get that unclipped, it just pops right off. And that's our old timing belt there. It's pretty stretched and worn. It's pretty floppy. It's a good thing we're getting it done now. It has a lot of slack in it, and he plans to off-road this thing. So that much slack in off-road, clutch dumping kind of environment, it's not going to be good. So we're going to get this set timed at top dead center. We'll go over that shortly, and remove the tensioner and idler. So here I've got it set to top dead center. It's a pretty simple setup. It's an arrow on the crank pulley and an arrow on the front cover. If we go over to the cam, it's got 2 lines that line up with the top surface of the head or the bottom surface of the valve cover. It's also got little arrows on the inside towards the bolt that also line up. It's also got a on the cam gear on the top, it's got a flat spot to show the top of the cam gear, and a text that says up to show you where the top of the engine is. And this is me finagling the camera so you can see. And there's those little teeth that line up with the lines with the top of the cylinder head. In this case, this didn't line up exactly with the crank on time. It was still a degree or two off, I'd assume, from the stretched belt. And it's okay a degree or two off. That doesn't mean you're going to be a full tooth off. You're going to notice. You're not going to notice a degree or two. So this is with the tensioner, idler removed, the belt removed, still keeping time. You take this plastic piece off to gain access to the water pump bolts. It's just 4 10mm bolts around the circumference of that. There and there. And you want to put a pan underneath to catch the coolant. It's usually about a gallon and a half of coolant. You got nice garage floors like this, you definitely want to put a pan underneath it. This is a mobile job, so I got to be extra clean. It's a pretty simple procedure removing this. I'll be doing the cam seal and the crank seal while the water pump drains. It's a 14mm headed bolt there. And I'll be doing the crank seal behind here. I'm just going to take off the bolt and pull off the crank pulley. So in order to get the cam gear off, I wrap the belt around it like this and hold it tight. And I'm able to get my impact wrench to get it off. I wedge my hand behind the head and kind of just hold it as firm as possible. You don't want that thing spinning and bending valves with an impact on it. You want to make sure you got a good grip. You could also put a pry bar in one of the teeth of the cam gear to the cylinder head to hold it. I've already gotten this one broken loose. So it's just a simple matter of taking the bolt out, pulling the gear off, getting a pick or flathead screwdrivers and prying the seal out, and grease up the new one a little bit. And you just tap it in with an extension or a hammer. The cam gear will only go back on one way, so you don't have to worry about timing there. It's got this key that only aligns one way with the cam, so no timing worries there. It just goes on exactly one way. There's the up text and the flat spot if you couldn't see them earlier. Alright, so we're just letting the water pump drain. Took out all the bolts, just gave it a little wiggle, draining it slow. Like I said earlier, you don't want this particular job, I didn't want to make a big mess. If you wanted, you could just yank it off and spill all the coolant everywhere. Cool thing about this engine, it's got, when it's at top dead center, the keys on the cam and the crank both line up with the engine. I thought that was kind of neat. Thought you guys should see that. Alright, so I'm gonna let that drain. Now we got this plastic piece needs to go on before the belt. If you put it on after the belt, it's a pain to get in. So make sure you put that plastic piece back before the rest of the belt. I did not, so I had to take the belt back off and redo it. And it's not fun. So I had to relieve tension, remove the belt, and I got to tension it again. Make sure you put that plastic bit back in. Alright, so this is tensioned and timed. So I got that torqued to 54 to 55 foot-pounds. Got it lined up. I got up on the up. I got my arrows lined up here. And it's got good tension on it. So what I do is I spin it counterclockwise to remove tension off the bottom, and then I put a little more tension on this tensioner. I get the screwdriver and I put maybe 5 to 10 pounds of force on it and then tighten that bolt down there. The torque on that's 33 foot-pounds, same as the idler. So once you get the tension set, you torque them both 33 foot-pounds. And yeah, I just put the screwdriver on the top and push it down. And there should be a similar gap as to before with the bolt and the tensioner slot. Mine was almost exactly the same, fully tensioned, just a little sliver gap on the bottom. It should be the same for most kits. It should be about the same as it was before. A good tension is when the belt flexes about 45 degrees when you twist it. And both sides are good, so I've tensioned this side first, it's good. And then I set the tensioner on this side, and it's good. You shouldn't be able to move this. If you got really strong brute force, you might be able to spin it, but you shouldn't be able to spin it easily. If it spins, you could get some screeching from the belt slipping. If it's too tight, you'll get howling from the belt friction on the tensioners. There'll be too much friction for the bearings to keep up, so you got to get that portion right. We're all timed up. We're going to do reverse steps. We torqued the water pump bolts to 86 inch-pounds or 7 foot-pounds. We also did thermostat while we're there. We're ready to go back together. I got this alternator bracket up. I pushed it up and tightened that 14 millimeter bolt as to give me more clearance. His alternator was sitting on top of that tensioner. I torqued that to 55 foot-pounds. I just shoved a pry bar against one of the flat spots in the head to hold the cam gear steady while I torqued it right through this hole here, and it worked perfectly. Just make sure not to crack or pinch anything. Be careful when you're torquing these things. So now to put the covers together, we got the upper cover and the lower timing cover. We'll get on there. We'll get the crank pulley, harmonic balancer pulley on afterwards, after the timing covers. We'll get the belt on, get it tensioned, get the alternator dust cover on, fill it full of coolant and bleed it, and that's it. There's one 12 millimeter bleeder on top of the engine for the coolant, and you're done.